Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we have our resident philosopher on, Dr. Ryan Mullins. We're going to be touching on his recent book, God and Emotion, published with Cambridge University Press as part of their Cambridge Elements series. It's a wonderful series, and I actually plan to go through some of those later in the year, and going forward on my channel, I plan to do certain videos summarizing different books in that series. So this is definitely a sort of a teaser, a foretaste, as it were. So basically, for those of you watching, the structure of the video and its contents, we're basically going to be going through the different chapters contained in Ryan's book. So chapter 1, chapter 2, and so on. If you want, you can look in the description. I've got a little outline of this video down there. And so let's really just dig into it. So the first question that I have is really just if you could give us maybe a 60-second rundown of the new book, God and Emotion.
Mm-hmm. So the goal of the book is just to give an introduction to the intersection of philosophy of emotions and philosophy of religion. And so what I do is I just lay out some of the basics of like what an emotion is, the role emotions play in reason and morality. And then I use that to look at debates over God's emotional life, which is basically just a debate about impassibility and passibility. So I try to do my best to look at arguments for and against each view and just kind of see how each side responds to different objections.
Okay, and so like I did mention at the beginning that it's the Cambridge Elements series. So could you like sort of flesh out for us what that is?
Right. Yeah, so the Cambridge Elements series, it's Cambridge University Press's response to Oxford's a very short introduction series. And so the goal of each Element series is to write short, like up-to-date books in a variety of topics. And so they're starting Element series on like just about everything, like biology, history, philosophy, theology, mathematics, like you name it, they're doing it. And so my book is in the Philosophy of Religion series, which is edited by Yujin Nagasawa. And the Philosophy of Religion series aims to put out 30 books on hot topics in the field. And each book has to be around 30,000 words, which is like 60 pages or so. And that presents like a really unique challenge when you're trying to write up a book like this, because I have to be aware of like all sorts of different issues and try to figure out how to state them as clearly and concisely as possible. Because like my original manuscript was about 80,000 words. So I had to cut just a lot of stuff, a lot of material down to narrow it down. And then that way readers can just kind of get a good feel for the kinds of issues that are at debate that they need to consider.
Yeah, wow. So I'm guessing you probably made those into like papers or things like that. So you're
Papers,
maybe the problem of arbitrary creation one.
That's one. And then there's a book project that Jordan Wesling and John Peckham and I are talking about, where I might co-author a book just defending passibility in a much more like rigorous and longer way.
Nice. Okay. And so this sort of brings us into the question of like, well, why should we care about God's emotional life at all? Like, what's at stake here? Like, aren't we just sort of doing this highfalutin theorizing concerning God's emotional life? Like, why on earth should this matter at all?
Right. Yeah, so I've got a forthcoming episode of my own podcast where I talk about like my own personal reasons that like I think are at stake. And what I noticed when I was working on this project is this is like a topic that I found people had like really visceral reactions to. And this wasn't just from like theists and different Christians. Like, I mean, this was from atheists and agnostics. And so I think for a lot of people, the issue at stake here is whether or not God can possibly care about us or possibly love us. So for many of the 20th century, like the debate over impassibility, it's primarily about whether or not God can be loving towards his creatures. And this is because one of the issues at stake is whether or not God has empathy, and if God can suffer with us out of empathy. And impassibility says no, God does not have any empathy, and it says no, God does not suffer. So whereas passibility is going to say that God has empathy and God can suffer with us. And then closely associated to this is debates. This debate is like questions about God's moral goodness and his providence. So is God like perfectly good? People on both sides of the impassibility debate, they're always calling into question the other side's ability to maintain God's perfect moral goodness. So what's at stake here is a series of questions about whether or not God is empathetic, loving, and morally perfect.
Yeah, and just like just God's nature, like what God is like. Like this really this is one of the core debates concerning models of God. And so if you're a believer in God, you need some sort of account of God's character or God's nature. What kind of God do you believe in, right? Is it going to be a classical theistic one? Is it a neoclassical one? And so really, if you're going to be committed to a certain model of God, it's going to have certain entailments concerning, these different emotional dispositions of God or God's emotional life. And so those entailments might actually pose problems either for your model of God or for theism in general or things like that. So really, I think this is important for everyone on the debate concerning God's existence and God's nature, really. So it's really of monumental significance. And so the last sort of preliminary question that I want to ask is basically if you could sort of give us the brief layout of the structure of the book. So, yeah.
So I divide the book up into 7 sections. And so the first one is just an introduction that lays out the history of the debate. And in the introduction, I explain that like impassibility and passibility, these are attributes that you can find in different rivals models of God. So what I'm going to do is I'll narrow down to just 2, which is classical theism and neoclassical theism. So that way readers can kind of, see how this debate goes over, different models of God. So in chapter 1, I discuss just like some of the basics of philosophy of motion, just what's going on there. In chapter 2, I articulate classical theism, and then I situate impassibility within a classical model of God, so you can see, hopefully, how these things interact with each other. In chapter 3, I discuss how passibility, again, like is compatible with different models of God, but I'll focus just on the neoclassical model of God. And then chapter 4, I look at the love of God, which is like a major point of contention in these debates over impassibility. And then chapter 5, I look at the wrath of God and like God's moral judgments as a whole. And this is like, I found this really interesting because this is a point of debate that doesn't get as much attention as God's love does. So I thought it would be pretty important to introduce that into the discussion. And then chapter 6 looks at what it's like divine empathy, and then what I call the problem of creepy emotions. And this is another debate that I saw get some discussion, but it didn't have a lot of rigor. So I thought it was important to like really develop these objections and the responses to this topic. And then at that point, the book's done, and I just leave it up to readers to decide how they feel about this topic or about this debate over God's emotional life.
Yeah, and I'm sure you also have like a bunch of different like references in there for like for people who want to like dig further into the topic as well.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so with those sort of preliminary points out of the way, we can start delving into the contents or the topics contained in the book itself. So the first chapter is on emotion, right? And so the philosophy of emotion, like what is an emotion, how does it relate to passion, things like that. So could you sort of give us a kind of synopsis of the contents of this chapter? So I'll turn it over to you for that.
Mm-hmm. So this chapter has like the following questions. So it's just, what is an emotion? What is the relationship between emotions and truth? What is the relationship between emotions and morality? Like those are the big kind of questions. So I'll just start with the first one here. So I follow a lot of contemporary philosophers, and I take an emotion to be a mental state that involves an evaluation of a situation and that has an affect that is either positive or negative. And so what this means is that an emotion has a cognitive and an affective component to it. And so the cognitive component is what the emotion is about. So when you're having an emotion, you're mentally representing the world as being a certain way. So for example, anybody watching this video, they're probably mentally representing this video as like, having particular properties, like being very exciting. At least I'm hoping so. I mean, I don't know. And then the affective component is that there's something that it feels like to have that mental representation, which is they're going to feel really excited. And so that's the affect of the emotion. So the cognitive aspect of the emotion, though, like that's what distinguishes emotions from other affective states, like just like pure bodily sensations. So like unlike various bodily sensations, like your emotions are always about something. They always have like an object that they aim to evaluate or represent. And then there's this further aspect of emotions that's like is actually really important for the debate over God's emotional life. So your emotions are always grounded in a particular cognitive basis that you have. And so the cognitive basis is what philosophers of emotion call your cares or concerns. So just like, what do you actually care about? And what you care about, it creates a disposition in you to have certain kinds of emotional responses to the world. So what you care about is what you take to be worthy of your attention and worthy of your action. And so these are cares and concerns that create these emotional dispositions towards certain situations. So because of this, like when you have an emotion, you're evaluating something that you think is worthy of your attention and that you think is worthy of acting on behalf of. And so this is why a person's emotions, like they really help you understand like a person's reasons for acting the way that they do. Now, sometimes these dispositions in philosophy of emotions, they're called sentiments. And then other times they're talked about in terms of a person's like moral character traits, like being cruel or kind. So for example, like love and hate, these are like really classic examples of sentiments towards like a person or a thing or an institution. So if you're disposed to love a particular person, like you're going to be disposed to have a whole range of emotional reactions to that person, just kind of dependent upon their situation.
Okay, yeah. I mean, like it definitely seems that there's this whole concoction of your like dispositions and concerns and your reasons, really what your cares are and so on. It seems like that plays like a huge role in like understanding the full breadth and depth of someone's emotional life, as you've sort of pointed out. And this, of course, raises the question of whether or not there are like other features, either of the world or like of ourselves, right, that likewise play a central role in our emotional life. And so as philosophers, right, like we love truth. We want to get more true beliefs. We want to get rid of false beliefs, things like that. We definitely want to have a sort of adequation of our mind to the world, right? So we definitely want truth. So I'm definitely curious of how like truth itself comes into like this story of emotions, right? Like, are emotions true or false, or like appropriate or inappropriate? Like, how does truth relate to all of this?
Right. So since your emotions, they evolve like a mental representation and these evaluations of situations. So because of that, your emotions can be true or false, depending on how well your emotion like tracks a given situation. So sometimes people like they get annoyed when I say that sort of thing. When I say your emotions can be true or false, but you notice like they're getting annoyed at that. Like they're annoyed, and they're making and being annoyed, like they're making an evaluation of like a particular philosophical claim that they think is just deeply mistaken. And then also, usually these are the same kind of people who tell me I should be outraged by what I'm seeing in the news right now. And so they think that they can tell me what kind of emotional reaction I should be having. And I'm like, well, that seems kind of curious. And what I noticed, though, is like actually we're constantly telling people that we think that we can tell them what kind of emotion they should be having or not having. So here's some different examples. So you've probably heard statements like, you're overreacting to the situation. Things are not that bad. Or you might have heard other things too, where you might say to somebody, you have every right to be angry because what you're experiencing is wrong. And so in the first example, like the speaker is judging that a person's emotions are inaccurate, whereas in the second example, like they're judging the person's emotions are accurate. So what it seems like is that your emotions can be accurate or inaccurate depending on how well they track the values in reality. And kind of closely connected to this, your emotions can also be justified or unjustified. So your emotions are justified if you have like good reasons to have the felt evaluation that you're having. So for example, say you're watching like a really sad movie. Well, if the story is actually like really sad, then you're going to be justified in feeling sad because anybody who's watching that sad movie is going to feel sad. Whereas maybe consider like a different situation where something bad has happened to you. So you have like, you've got the emotion of anger, but say that whatever you experienced was just like a really like minor offense. So you're correct in being angry, but like you're demanding blood in response to like a really minor offense. You might think, well, gosh, you're overreacting, right? So like you got the right emotion, but the amount of the emotion that you have is just unjustified because you shouldn't be demanding blood in response to like a minor offense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So like, it sounds as though they're really tied up with like judgments of accuracy and inaccuracy, or like lack of justification or having justification. But in doing so, it's almost as though we're like introducing a sort of like normative dimension to emotions, right? I mean, there seems to be like a certain sense in which some emotions ought to be evoked or felt by certain situations. And like, how should we kind of understand this normativity, right? This sort of oughtness. Is it a kind of epistemic normativity, like, or is it like a moral normativity, or is it like a unique kind? Or so can you really sort of touch on that for us?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a bit of both. So, but a lot of it, like, it just kind of depends on some of your background assumptions about epistemology and morality, because everybody in these debates, they're bringing different theories to the table. So, for example, there's a philosopher of motion named Robert Roberts, and he affirms moral. I know his parents gave him the name Robert Roberts. Well, whatever. So he's a moral realist. So he brings that kind of assumption to the table, which a lot of contemporary work in philosophy of emotions do. Roberts also, he defends like a virtue theory of epistemology, and he's also written a lot on the role of cultivating emotions in a virtuous life. So for someone like him, he's bringing a bunch of different like virtue-based theory assumptions to his understanding of the normativity of emotions. So let me give you an example like from Aquinas, somebody else who's very much working in the virtue tradition of kind of how this plays out. So Aquinas says, imagine somebody has witnessed a really tragic event. And so he says, further, imagine this person is just not disturbed. They're just completely undisturbed by what they saw. Now, Aquinas is like, a virtuous person is going to be disturbed by witnessing a really horrendous event. So if a person's not disturbed by something awful, then Aquinas is going to be like, something's wrong with this guy. What's wrong with him? Well, there's a couple options here. So Aquinas is like, maybe the person's just ignorant of some different moral facts in the situation, and that's why they're not disturbed. In which case, Aquinas is going to say, well, that person needs some moral instruction. like because there's certain things that they ought to know. They ought to know these moral facts. So there's a kind of moral and normative and epistemic normativity at play there.
Mm.
But another possibility that Aquinas mentions is like maybe a person does have the right moral knowledge, but they just don't care. And in which case, Aquinas says their moral character is vicious, and so that person like ought to cultivate like a virtuous character traits.
Yeah.
And so what you see going on in this sort of story Aquinas is telling is you see different epistemic and moral obligations or normativity like coming into play here.
Yeah, yeah. And so that of course raises the question of whether these are sort of like objectively true normative claims, or are we sort of just projecting these, or are they relative in some sense? So I know like different arguments against impassibility, for instance, right? They're probably going to rest on kind of an objective understanding of this kind of normativity of an emotional response. Like, for instance, any fully informed agent who cares about the interests of someone objectively ought to feel negative emotions toward that person's profound or intense suffering, right? So that's kind of, I know we'll touch on that later on in this episode, but that's kind of one different argument that someone might make in this debate. But that sort of seems to kind of presuppose the objectivity of this normativity. And so like I'm wondering, how do thinkers within the God and emotion debate explore and sort of interact with this question of objectivity? And I'll bring it over to you in just one second, but I do want to give a sort of example to help at least the listeners sort of, appreciate the strength of this point. So like one example is that of psychopaths, right? So we might think that they are in some sense missing what they ought to have with respect to their emotional responses, right? Like they would in some sense be objectively impaired in respect of their truth-tracking emotional faculties, say. But like maybe, right, maybe the psychopath will simply say that we're the ones who are impaired, or like maybe there isn't some sort of objective, we aren't sort of tracking with our emotions these truths. So I'm kind of wondering how we sort of non-arbitrarily decipher whose emotions are truth tracking when we have, the psychopath over here and you and me, sort of butting heads with respect to our emotions. So I know I gave you kind of two questions there, but I'll turn it over to you for what you think about here.
Yeah, so these are, like you said, these are two different questions, but I think they're both really interesting. So the first question, I'm just going to say yes, like thinkers in these debates, they do offer different arguments that are based on normative claims that they take to be objectively true. So like the argument that you laid out, for example, like that's one that I see something like it throughout most of the 20th century. So lots of different philosophers and theologians think that a morally perfect God ought to be disturbed by witnessing a really tragic event. And when they look at, they're like, look, the whole history of the world is filled with sin and tragedy. So God better be upset. And to which like different proponents of impassibility, they're going to push back and say that there's something morally wrong if God were to be emotionally moved by anything other than the greatest good. Mm-hmm. So anything less than the greatest good, you ought not to be morally moved by it, according to some of these thinkers. So someone like who's an impassibilist of this sort, they're going to be like, well, say God sees Joe suffering, and they're going to say, well, it would be wrong for God to be moved by Joe's suffering because Joe is not the greatest good. And so what you have here is like these just different intuitions about normativity, and they're really coming out to play in these different debates. Now, in response to the like the psychopath idea, we can get into this a little bit later when we talk about empathy. But psychopaths, they're missing what's called the affective component of empathy. And so psychopaths, like they're really good with the cognitive aspect, which is like knowing that you have a particular emotion, but they're really bad at the feeling the emotion with you. And so psychologists, what they'll do is they'll point out that this impairment to the affective aspect of empathy, like that's an explanation for why psychopaths have these deficiencies in their moral reasoning compared to others. But of course, like as Joe, as you pointed out, like I mean, a psychopath will just say, maybe I just disagree with all of your moral judgments. In all of you psychologists, you're just wrong. But like that's basically just like how you sort out those sort of moral disagreements. I mean, you're gonna have to ask an expert on moral philosophy, and I'm just I'm not doing normative philosophy. I'm not going to tell you what to do because I'm not your mom. So I'm just going to do the metaphysics, basically.
Yeah. Hashtag you're not my mom.
Exactly.
Anyway, so I did want to. Well, maybe we can table that just because. Well, I did want to say that just for the audience, like I do plan to talk about do like one of my lectures on just by myself on moral disagreement and whether or not that poses a challenge to moral realism. I don't think it does, but it's definitely a really interesting kind of argument, and that's kind of what we're getting at here with respect to emotional disagreement. So I did want to definitely just touch on that because that might come up in debates concerning passibility and impassibility. So we are starting to see how like the debate concerning passibility and impassibility overlaps with all these different areas, and especially the moral questions, right? And so can you sort of talk more about the connection between emotions, emotions on the one hand, and sort of morality on the other in the context of this debate?
Hmm. So there's several different ways, but I'll just mention a few that I discuss in the book. So first, emotions, they can reveal what a person subjectively cares about. So if you find like a friend crying over the death of their grandmother, like you're going to conclude that this person, like she really cares deeply for her grandmother. Second, emotions, they can be revelatory of objective value. And so this is because emotions involve an experiential acquaintance with the value of an object. So for example, theists are often going to say you should just come and experience the goodness of God. And so the idea is that like having some kind of experience of God, like you will become acquainted with the goodness of God. And then others are going to point out that it's only through emotions that you're able to experience and identify objective values in the world. So some philosophers like Tasia Scruton is going to say, if you don't have emotions, then you're not going to be able to really be in contact with the moral landscape. Third, emotions can help motivate your moral reasoning. So emotions are evaluations of what you take to be worthy of your attention. And so emotions, they can really like lock your focus in on different moral premises that you're trying to deliberate about because you care so much about them. You want to get it right. So you're really focused in on them. And then fourth, emotions, they motivate your moral actions because emotions are evaluations of what you take to be worthy of acting on behalf of. And so a person acts on behalf of something precisely because she judges it to have like a certain value or disvalue. So that's some of the ways that I talk about in the book for the relationship between emotions and morality.
Yeah, so that definitely does seem like a good way to sort of close out the sort of chapter 1 stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
we went over like the different relations that our cares and our dispositions and our reasons have in relation to our emotions. We talked about what is an emotion and how it relates to morality and things like that. So it's sort of setting the stage like you do in your first chapter. So let's move on then to chapter 2, focusing on impassibility, or the Impassible God, as it's titled, right? So can you sort of give us a brief kind of synopsis for this second chapter?
Mm-hmm. So in this chapter, what I do is I lay out the classical theistic understanding of God. And you and I have talked about this in other videos. So like classical theism affirms that God is timeless, immutable, simple, and impassible. And so for anybody watching, like if you want to see those discussions on those topics, like, you know, we've got several videos we've done on the majesty of reason. So you can just subscribe to this channel and find those videos elsewhere, right? Now, so what I do in the book, though, I try to tease out like the classical theistic claims that timelessness, immutability, and simplicity, that they're like systematically connected to impassibility. I've got a separate paper called "Why Can't the Impassible God Suffer," which is going to be linked to in the descriptions.
Yeah.
And so in that paper, I argue that they're not actually systematically connected. But for the book, though, I just try to just assume that they are. But I think what's really going on is a lot of classical theists, I think they're often sneaking in the doctrine of divine simplicity into their arguments in some sort of question-begging way. But like I said, I just kind of set some of those issues aside for the book. So the main thing to focus on in this video is like what exactly is impassibility and which emotions an impassible God can have. So impassibility means that it is impossible for God to suffer. It is impossible for God to be moved, caused, or influenced by anything external to God. And impassibility also means that God can't have passions. But this is actually really difficult to figure out because there's a lot of disagreement in the classical tradition over what counts as a passion. And so, like I said, this is where things get really complicated because our modern English word of emotion, like that covers like a whole range of different affective states that, you know, the classical tradition would sometimes consider some of those things to be passions, but not all of those things. And then you can even find some more recent theologians, like in the 1800s, say that, you know, God has no passions, but God does have emotions. And so things get really weird when you're trying to like understand this classical story of God's emotional life. So in order to like try to make things a lot easier, I identify 3 different criteria that classical theists have used to discern which emotions God can have. And so the first says that God can have any emotion that is consistent with perfect rationality. And then the second criteria says that God can have any emotion that is consistent with God's perfect moral goodness. But those 2 criteria, they're not terribly interesting because a passibilist is also going to affirm those criteria. Mm-hmm. So this doesn't really help you fully understand impassibility. So what really takes you all the way to impassibility is the classical theistic like understanding of God's like divine happiness. And so the classical theist says that God is in a state of pure, undisturbed bliss that is based entirely on himself. And so the third and final criteria is that God cannot have any emotion that conflicts with his perfect happiness.
Yeah, so I do kind of want to dwell on this point a little bit further, right? Because I want viewers to sort of understand that this is kind of like a very strong and striking claim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that it's like immediately false, but it is very striking.
Sure.
And I kind of want to connect this to timelessness in particular, and God's sort of single, timeless and tenseless now, as it were, in which God possesses the fullness of his life, right? So if we combine impassibility with timelessness, well, then we seem, impassibility as you've articulated it, we seem to get that God, like always, eternally and timelessly, unchangingly, tenselessly experiences this sort of pure, unadulterated, absolute bliss and happiness and blessedness, right? But this is true even during things like the Holocaust, right? Or when someone is getting brutally raped, right? Even while the damned are consciously and everlastingly tormented, this is the case, right? I mean, like, can you help us sort of draw out the connection between timelessness on the one hand and impassibility, and sort of how this might pose problems for classical theism? And of course, before turning it over to you, I'll turn it over to you to get that in just a second. But here's one way we might think that this is kind of like a prima facie plausible way to fill out this kind of argument. Again, I don't offer this as sort of like decisive demonstration or deductive proof or anything. I'm just giving one way to plausibly fill out this kind of argument. That has at least some prima facie pull, right? So basically, we might plausibly think that a fully rational, fully informed, and knowledgeable being, experiential being, which cares about the flourishing and interests of a person, objectively ought to feel negative emotions towards that person's profound and intense suffering and languishing, right? That seems to just be constitutive of being fully informed and knowledgeable and caring about the flourishing of the thing. That is to say, when it suffers, when it truly languishes, it seems as though you kind of track that with your experiential states. You feel sort of negative emotions towards that, and that just seems intuitively plausible. Just speaking in terms of our intuitions. But any being which cares about the flourishing and interests of the person, then, but which does not feel such negative emotions when horrors afflict that individual, would either not be fully rational or not fully informed or knowledgeable, right? But the impassible God cannot experience negative emotions, and yet is nevertheless supposed to be fully rational and fully informed and knowledgeable, right? So we seem to have this sort of tension between that intuitively plausible principle on the one hand and impassibility on the other, right? I mean, either if we accept that principle, which seems at least prima facie plausible, either God's not impassible, or else he's not fully rational, or else he's not fully informed and knowledgeable about the facts of the situation. So that's sort of my brief kind of spelling out of this argument. And again, I don't offer it as a kind of like demonstration or irrefutable knockdown argument. I'm just sort of spelling it out. And so maybe you can touch on those 2 points that I was bringing up.
Yeah, so I think this is a really powerful argument, and it actually looks really similar to something that Nicholas Wolterstorff has offered in the past. So Wolterstorff, what he does is he focuses on Aquinas' claim that I mentioned earlier about like a virtuous person ought to be upset by witnessing a really tragic event. And so Wolterstorff is like, well, look, if you're going to accept those claims about like virtuous people, then you ought to accept those claims about like a morally perfect God. And I touch a bit on this, but I don't really get too much into this in the book because I found the responses to this argument like really unimpressive. So basically what I found was classical theists responded to Wolterstorff with this sort of like kind of straw man question. And it goes something like this. So they say like, well, which would you prefer? A passible God who suffers with you, or an impassible God who cannot save you? Or I'm sorry, no, that's not right. Which would you prefer, a passible God who suffers with you, or an impassible God who can save you from your suffering? So a passible God supposedly can't save you at all, whereas an impassible God can save you. And I find it really difficult to figure out what exactly the force is behind a question like that, because it seems like it's assuming really odd things about passibility. And these replies actually are pretty explicit about this. They'll say that a passible God cannot save you from your suffering, because if God suffers, then God would need someone to save him from his suffering. And I just find that a straw man because the passibilist still thinks God's omnipotent. So why can't an omnipotent God save himself from suffering that he freely entered into? So I just decide I'm just going to, set that aside for the book. But notice there's something about these kind of responses, though. They don't actually address this Wolterstorff style argument that we're discussing here. Like, it actually just pivots the conversation. And I noticed this a lot in the literature, which is like another reason why I just don't include it in my book, because people are constantly pivoting to different discussions. And I'm like, can we please stay on topic for a second here? So I do know there's this one other way, though, that you could possibly respond to an objection like this. So a classical theist, like Brian Davies, it could say, well, look, God's just not a moral agent. And so then you would get out of these kind of worries. But a lot of classical theists are unwilling to make that move because it's pretty extreme. And and a lot of classical theists, and then myself included, are also going to say, like, I don't really quite understand how you can square that with the claim that God is the greatest good and the source of morality. So these are things, like I said, I don't really go into in the book because I just wasn't really satisfied with a lot of the discussion on these things.
Yeah. So for Brian Davis, like, does he say that? How does he kind of like try to motivate this? Does he say that, like, well, if God had moral obligations a la moral agents, well, then he'd sort of be subject to something external to himself? And since God, the radically independent God of classical theism, cannot be subject to anything ad extra to the divine nature, then it follows that he doesn't have any obligations and hence is not a sort of moral agent. Is that his kind of his argument? Because I am somewhat familiar with his work on this, but can you touch on why he might sort of think that, and what others have sort of responded? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot more details than that. Some of the things you can kind of try to throw in, like a doctrine of analogy or something like that, to be like, well, he's not really a person; he's only like analogously, something like that. But yeah, that's the biggest move, is to say God is not subject to any sort of moral law or moral demands or moral considerations. Fill in whatever sort of ethical theory you want. God's not subject to those things, so is not going to count as a moral agent.
Mm-hmm. So I'm still just sort of wondering, like, off the top of my head, like, does that really kind of, I mean, I know you agree with me, but does that really like avert the argument, right? Because we're not necessarily, I mean, some people might cast it in terms of obligation, but we're not necessarily saying that, it's sort of like an obligation that, that, perfectly informed and people who grasp the situation, we're not saying they are obliged to feel this way. We're sort of just saying it's like constitutive of the very nature of being a fully informed, rational, knowledgeable, experiential agent and fully grasping the situation. And part of the nature of flourishing and caring about those things, that it simply sort of falls out of that the appropriate response is these negative emotions. And so I don't know, it's not at all clear that we're sort of imposing some sort of obligation on God, but we're sort of just saying that, well, how can you claim that he is fully informed and fully knowledgeable given this seemingly inappropriate emotional reaction to it? It's not as though we're saying, like, we're imposing this extrinsic moral law on him. So maybe that's one way we could go. Yeah, do you have anything to say about that?
I think it depends on what your ethical theory is, because you don't necessarily have to bring in obligations. You could just talk in terms of what's the most rationally appropriate thing to do, because moral considerations are rational considerations. And so a lot of people, when they're arguing for why should I think God's like perfectly good, they're going to say, well, God's omniscient and he's perfectly rational. Well, moral considerations are rational considerations. So a perfectly moral God, well, it's one's going to be perfectly rational and perfectly knowledgeable. And so there's a lot of arguments of this sort. So yeah, I think so. You don't have to put it in just in terms of obligations. Like, that's like, I guess, part of the story. But the other part of the story is, it still seems to me that, like, if you're going to say God's perfectly good, which, like, I mean, the classical theist wants to say this. I don't know which, like, model of God wants to deny that. If you're not talking about God in terms of a moral agent, I just don't really know what we're talking about anymore. I can cast this in a lot of different ethical theories, but it still seems like God's going to be doing whatever is the right thing to do. And that seems like that's what a moral agent would do. So personally, I don't find a lot of these arguments persuasive. But there's been some more recent work that I guess I'll put this to your listeners. Mark Murphy has a book called God's Own Ethics, where he tries to tease out this argument in a lot more detail than Davies does. So if you're kind of interested in maybe this sort of line of reasoning and how this looks and how this goes on different ethical theories, Mark Murphy's book is the way to go. And so that might help the classical theist out a bit more with this kind of claim.
Okay, sweet. That's good. So that probably suffices for now for the sort of chapter 2 on impassibility. We've gone through maybe one problem that someone might level, or maybe a few problems that someone might level towards it, and we've also defined impassibility and so on. So I think it's time that we can sort of shift to chapter 3 on the passible. Perhaps you can again a synopsis of passibility in connection with models of God.
So Passibility can be found in a bunch of different models of God. And so I thought it was important for the book to just focus on one, because otherwise the book was going to be a lot longer than I was allowed to do. So I focused just on Neoclassical Theism. And again, this is a model of God we discussed here on Majesty of Reason. We've also done some videos on Crusade Against Ignorance. So if you want all the juicy details, like, you've got other videos you can watch on that. So basically what I do is I say this. So neoclassical theism that I develop in the book, it says that God is temporal, mutable, unified, and passible. And in the book, I try to draw out some of the systematic connections between these attributes in a way that I've not done in any other writings. So neoclassical theism, it's not open theism because it affirms that God knows the future. And it's also not panentheism or pantheism because it affirms a kind of distinction between a creator and a creature. And then also neoclassical theism is not process theology because it's not affirming a process metaphysics. So for this video, though, I'll just focus, I guess, just on passibility. So divine passibility affirms that God can be moved and influenced by things that are external to the divine nature. So God can suffer with us, and God can have a very wide range of emotions that are consistent with perfect rationality and perfect moral goodness. However, there's a little bit more to the story, though. So philosophers and theologians who affirm passibility, they also affirm that God has empathy. And this is really important because, as we mentioned earlier, impassibility in the classical tradition, they explicitly deny that God has empathy. So I spend quite a bit of time in this chapter trying to discuss like empathy and then a version of passibility that affirms something called Omni Subjectivity. And Omni Subjectivity is said to be God's perfect capacity to engage in total empathy with all phenomenal conscious states of all creatures.
Yeah. So for the audience, I know you just mentioned sort of a phenomenal conscious state. So can you sort of fill out what that means for the audience?
Right. So these are mental states that are sometimes referred to as experiential knowledge. And so the technical term is knowledge of what it is like. So what it is like to see the color red, what it is like to feel the sun on your skin, what it's like to feel embarrassed. These are all phenomenal states, and they're not reducible to what's called propositional knowledge, which is just knowledge that something is the case, because phenomenal knowledge involves something that it's like, what it is like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this phenomenal knowledge, of course, connects to empathy because, empathy seems to be, it seems as though you need to like sort of connect and sort of be able to understand what it's like to be the other person and to understand what they're experiencing and so on. So can you kind of relate this back to divine empathy and passibility and how it sort of connects to experiential knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you empathize with someone, you're coming to know what it is like for that person to feel a particular way. Mm-hmm. So if we can use like just, Joe and I as an example. So Ryan empathizes with Joe if Joe knows that Joe is having a particular emotion. Ryan knows what it is like to have that emotion. And then something about Joe grounds Ryan's knowledge of what it is like for Joe to feel this particular way, to have this particular emotion. So when I empathize with Joe, like it's important to note that I'm coming to understand what it is like for Joe to feel this particular way. So when I'm consciously aware that I'm trying on a copy of Joe's emotions. So when I don't take this to be my own emotion, because the whole point of me empathizing is to try to understand what it's like for Joe to feel a particular way. So if I successfully empathize with Joe, I do feel what Joe feels, but that doesn't mean that my own emotional evaluation of the situation is going to necessarily agree with Joe's. Mm. And this is something Linda Zagzebski points out, and a lot of others do too. They'll say that empathy is actually an incredibly important step in coming to form sound moral judgments on other people. So when you come to empathize with someone else, you come to understand what they are feeling and what they're thinking and why they acted the way that they did. But when you come to have that kind of empathetic understanding, you're also in a really prime position to make your own emotional evaluation of the situation. And so at that point, you're in a position to agree or disagree with a person. And so when it comes to omni subjectivity, the claim is that God has total perfect empathy with all of these different creaturely conscious states. And then according to Linda Zagzebski, she says that means that God is able to be the perfect moral judge.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's good that you gave those sort of three different criteria of like empathizing with another person, right? Like you have to have that propositional knowledge. You have to know that they are having that particular emotion, mm-hmm. right? You have to have the sort of experiential knowledge of knowing what it is like to have that emotion, right? And you also, there's that sort of grounding, the further grounding thesis that something about the person with whom you're empathizing sort of grounds my own knowledge of what it's like for that person to feel the particular emotion. So it's that sort of tripartite thesis when it comes to empathy. So which I just wanted to highlight that for the audience. Now you were talking about omni subjectivity in connection to passibility, and so I'm wondering, because a lot of people are kind of influenced by the problem of creepy emotions and things like that. So I'm wondering if there's a kind of alternative to omni subjectivity for passibilists. Like we might think, as we discussed in our Answering Classical Theist Objections to Neoclassical Theism video, we might think that there are certain problems for omni subjectivity that just make us not want to have it on board. And so like I'm just wondering, like, where do we non-arbitrarily draw the line concerning what God feels with us and what he doesn't? Like we don't we presumably don't want some we don't want a criterion like, well, anything that's consistent with perfect rationality and perfect goodness, right? I mean, that's to be minimally informative. Like, we want something more informative than that. We want some more like content or flesh that we can give to this, provided that we want to avoid omni subjectivity. So, yeah, can you just touch on that for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something I go a bit into in chapter 6 of the book. So I try to develop like an alternative account based on Nagasawa's understanding of the maximal God thesis. So like you said, like, you know, if someone might say like, I just don't want omni subjectivity, maybe I think it's incoherent, so I just want like a weaker thesis. Well, then the weaker thesis would be God can have the maximal degree of empathy that's consistent with perfect rationality and perfect moral goodness. But this is an area that I just think it needs a lot more work. Like, I mean, ultimately, just all I end up doing is just show what different passibilist thinkers say about God's emotions and which ones they think are irrational or emotional for God to empathize with. That way readers can kind of, you know, get some examples of like what different passibilists are up to. But how you draw the line, though, I mean, what you have to do in order to draw the line is you have to bring in like a robust moral theory. And that's more than I can offer. So basically all I'll do in the book is just lay out the groundwork for someone to do that, because no one had really done that in a rigorous way. No one had laid out the groundwork for how to really think about these things. So if you want to do more, go for it. Be my guest. You're going to have to bring in some sort of robust moral theory.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so again, I think that'll be good to sort of wrap up the chapter 3 on passibility. You know, talking about omni subjectivity. You know, where we draw the line between how God feels with us, things like that. And so now we can sort of move on to chapter 4, which is focusing on, I believe, the love of God, right? And so. Can you again give us a kind of synopsis of God's love and how it kind of influences debates concerning God and emotion?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I pointed out at the beginning of the video is that the love of God has been like really a main point of contention in these debates over impassibility. So lots of theologians and philosophers in the 20th and 21st century, they claim that an impassible God cannot be loving. So, for example, my friend Tom Ord, he's offered like several different biblical and philosophical arguments for thinking that love involves empathetic response to others. And if that's correct, I mean, divine impassibility is in direct conflict with love because an impassible God cannot have empathy. So Ord's definition of love just rules impassibility out from the start. And then someone like Tasia Scruton, what she does, she points out that these arguments surrounding love, they've just reached a stalemate because each side's going to favor their own conception of divine love. And so again, like, you know, if you've got someone like Ord, he puts his view on the table, it's got empathy built into it. The classical theist is just going to go, well, I just reject that understanding of love. So the dialectic here, this debate over love, it just really stalled out. And so in light of this, what I try to do is I try to get the debate up and running again by just saying, you know, classical theist, I'm going to grant you your own understanding of love. And then let's see if, you know, your own understanding of love is actually consistent with impassibility. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is that classical theistic understanding of love? Can you sort of unpack that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do two different things in the book. So first thing is I discuss this idea of how uninfluenced God's love is. Because on impassibility, God's love is completely and utterly uninfluenced by anything external to God. So nothing about you, who you are, nothing about your very existence could influence God's love. And in fact, all of God's love is really self-love on classical theism. And then next, what I do is I kind of point out a lot of different thinkers throughout Christian history. They say that love involves two different desires. So first, there's this desire for the good of the beloved or the good for the person you love. So like you want what's best for them. And then second, there's this desire for unity with your loved one. So you want to have some kind of mutual closeness or unity with someone that you love. And in a recent paper defending impassibility, Eric Silverman complains that critics only attack the first desire, and he says they just completely ignore the second desire. And Silverman thinks that the second desire of love really helps impassibility out quite a bit in light of all these criticisms. So I decide, okay, fine, I'll just focus this debate on just the desire for unity and see, does that actually, really work with impassibility? So what I do in the book then is I consider Eleanor Stump's recent treatment of these two desires of love, because it's one of the most thorough Thomistic articulations of desires of love in these recent debates in philosophy of religion. So I spend quite a bit of time examining her view. But here's some of the highlights. So in order to have unity of love, Stump says that you and your beloved, that you need to have mutual closeness. And this involves that you and your beloved are both aware of each other and you're both willing to reveal yourself to each other. So like there's this willingness to share your innermost thoughts, desires, and concerns with your beloved. But you need that, but that's not all, because you need more. Stump says that you and your beloved need to have some kind of understanding or comprehension of each other. And according to Stump, you need to have some degree of empathy and emotional intelligence in order to understand your beloved, in order to be close to them. So if me and my beloved don't actually accept each other, if we're not able to really understand each other, then we're not going to be that close. And so in order to satisfy this desire to be united with your beloved, you and your beloved, they need to satisfy, all these different things for mutual closeness, this comprehension, this acceptance, this revelation of one another. That's all kind of wrapped up in this unity desire. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, So I know you pointed out that this conception of love is one that thinkers in the classical theist tradition sort of explicitly endorse, right? And so, I know you actually argue in the book, however, that this conception of love is inconsistent with impassibility, and you were hinting at that as well. So, right. I kind of want you to sort of take us through that argument, but before you do that, I do want to touch on how we might see this conception of love as incompatible with other classical theist commitments, not necessarily impassibility, right? Because you focus on impassibility in your book, but there might be problems with timelessness and divine simplicity. So I'll articulate both of those. The first one I'll focus on simplicity. So we might think that this sort of mutual closeness would seem to entail that this is not merely a logical relation on God's part, right? Not merely a sort of mind-dependent sort of thing, like that how we conceive of God. That would sort of be a logical relation, but would instead be a kind of real relation on God's part, right? And of course, for those who need a sort of refresher on this terminology, you can just check out our video called Classical Theism, and I think the problem of extrinsic change. I believe that's what it's called. And so, we might think that's not a logical. This mutual closeness seems to involve a real relation. Like how could you have a mutual, like a truly mutual closeness if it's a merely logical relation on one part instead of a real relation? So again, that's one problem that we might raise. And again, I'm not offering these as sort of deductive or things like that. Like again, this is sort of just prima facie problems. Again, another thing we might think is that if God loves contingent things like you and me, and love requires a sort of awareness of the beloved, well, then surely God's awareness can change, or at least vary across worlds. And we might think that it's implausible that changes in awareness are mere extrinsic changes, right? I mean, wholly outside the mind of the thinking subject itself, right? I mean, changes in awareness seem to involve changes in the sort of intrinsic conscious states of the subject itself. I mean, if that's not the case, then I'm almost losing my grasp on what we mean by awareness. And so those are that we might think that those are certain problems about simplicity. And I guess there's another one with timelessness. I mean, you were talking about how it's a sort of desire for the beloved, but if God's timeless and presentism is true, well, then there are lots of humans that exist or that will exist in the future, but that don't actually exist. And so it seems as though God's going to have unfulfilled desires on this account, because the fulfillment of the desire in question would seem to presuppose that the person actually exists, right? Like, how could you be in mutual union with and mutual love with something that doesn't exist? And so if future persons don't exist precisely because they're in the future, and we're presentists, say, it seems as though, and God truly, in virtue of his perfection and in virtue of his love, desires union with them. I don't know. It seems as though that God has an unfulfilled desire, and that's going to be some aspect of God's being that is unactualized. And so there are going to be lots of different ways that poses problems for classical theism, having an unfulfilled desire. Like that's a sort of that's explicitly rejected by impassibilists, that God has unfulfilled desires or things like that. So right. I know I gave you a lot to chew on there, but there are sort of those three related issues. Yeah. The first one is the sort of logical versus real relation, the mutual closeness. The second one is kind of like the contingent things and the varying awareness across worlds, because love seems to require awareness of the beloved, but we would have varying awareness across worlds, which seems to be an intrinsic mental state change. And then the third one, of course, was this sort of unfulfilled desire on the basis of timelessness and presentism. Yeah. So I know I'm giving you a lot to digest there, and I know you're also going to talk about how the conception of love is inconsistent with impassibility. Right. So those are four things. Sorry, I'll turn it over to you now, and you can take it wherever you wish to take it from here.
Right. No, what I think you're pointing out are some really serious problems. I don't get into those in the book because I only had 30,000 words. But yeah, the simplicity one, I think, is a really serious problem. And what a lot of people do when they're looking at Eleanor Stump, they criticize her because they point out that she weakens the doctrine of simplicity in order to avoid a bunch of different problems. And so a lot of contemporary proponents will point out you can't weaken simplicity like that without undermining the connections to timelessness and immutability. So they think Stump's view entails like some kind of diminishment or inconsistency with timelessness and immutability. So it's a right button to push on. The logical relation stuff, I think it's a really serious problem because I don't know how you could say I've got mutual closeness with things that I'm not actually related to, that I'm not really related to. Like that seems like a non-starter. And which I think is why someone like Catherine Rogers, who's a contemporary classical theist, just goes, we should not be saying that God's not really related to the universe. Like that's nuts. Like she's just like, that's just, we have to take that off the table. How to make these things consistent with her other understandings of timelessness, I don't know yet. But she's a really creative thinker, so she might come up with something. So we'll have to wait and see. So I guess I'll just talk about what I do in the book, though, which kind of hits on some of these issues. So there's two different things I do in the book. So first, what I do is I point out that I don't think it really makes any sense for a classical theist to speak in terms of God having desires. And so the entire idea of an impassible God having two desires of love, I think is just a non-starter. And this is because the God of classical theism is self-satisfied and so cannot have any desires. Further, desires, like they're future-oriented. And so having a desire implies that one's desire is not yet satisfied. Because otherwise, why would you have a desire for something you've already got it? You know.
Yeah.
So like a timeless and immutable God cannot have a future, and so cannot go from having a desire to having that desire satisfied. So the classical theism, like I think it's just off to a really rough start in terms of its own understanding of love. So that's the first thing I kind of point out. The second thing I do, I just developed this argument that an impassible God cannot satisfy the desire to be united with us. So according to Stump, again, to go back to her account, in order to have mutual closeness, God needs to have the deepest possible understanding of who we are. And what she points out is that this requires empathy. But an impassible God, on her own understanding, cannot have empathy. And an impassible God cannot possibly understand what it is like to be in your state of suffering. And an impassible God is, he's in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness. And he cannot have an acquaintance with the overwhelming majority of human emotional experience. I mean, an impassible God cannot have any degree of suffering, anticipation that turns into delight, longing, disappointment, and so on. So basically, like everything that makes us who we are as people, like everything that we deem important to reveal to those who we want to be close to. I mean, an impassible God has no understanding of any of that which makes us human. So an impassible God just cannot satisfy the basic requirements of mutual closeness for the unity of love. I mean, there's obviously a lot more detail to get into, and I do that in the book, but that's just the big idea, at least for this video.
Yeah. So before going on to the next chapter, I do want to maybe push back on one thing. So maybe the classical theist could appeal to Christ as a sort of, I don't know, as a sort of bridge between the impassible, immutable, absolutely simple God and the suffering of humanity. So maybe God can sort of empathetically, I don't know, I don't quite know how to articulate it, but I do know that some classical theists appeal to Christ, and he suffered and died on the cross, and took on the sins of the world, things like that. And so perhaps God can, in some sense, empathize with us in virtue of Jesus, suffering and dying on the cross and so on. Now, of course, there might be problems because, we're talking about Jesus' human nature, and Jesus' divine nature doesn't even stand in a real relation to that human nature so as to empathetically enter into it and understand it, things like that. So I guess that's one problem. But yeah, do classical theists sort of appeal to Jesus here, and how does that sort of play into what you're talking about?
Actually, this is the exact move that Eleanor Stump makes. So the desire love stuff is mainly in Wandering in Darkness, and then in her newer book Atonement, she's trying to work out just like the mechanics of the atonement. And so one of the things she does is she's like, well, we need an incarnation because God can't have empathy. Well, he can have empathy if he takes on a human nature, because the human nature can have empathy. I've got a couple different worries here that I haven't articulated very well in print yet. Here's, I guess, just two. So the first one is the very thing that prevents God from relating to me is God's lack of empathy. And if that's the case, then why is it that God can somehow also become incarnate in the human nature, be fully united to a human nature in such a way that it's just one person there and not two people? Because the very thing that prevents God from being united to my human nature, it seems like that should be the very thing that prevents God from being united to any human nature. But Stump just kind of goes, no, he can be united to this other human nature. Can't be united to anybody else's because he lacks empathy. But somehow he can be united to this human nature of Christ. I'm like, seems a bit odd, but okay. A second worry that I have is when you look at the really deep, nuanced details of Stump's account of incarnation, what you end up being is you and I and all of us are empathetically united to the human nature of Christ. We're not empathetically united to the divine nature. It's only the human mind, not the divine mind, that has the empathy. And it's only the human mind that is able to share these things with us. And so I still have these worries of, is this really God the Son empathizing with us? And she'll say, well, yeah, because the Son owns this human mind. But there's some other things I'm like, this looks like these different minds are like, one mind's empathizing with me, the other mind is not. That looks like two people. Which is what's called the Heresy of Historianism. And I've asked her about this in person, and she just says it's just not Nestorianism, but she's not giving me details of how it's not Nestorianism. So I don't know. It'd have to be a longer debate about that. But I've got some worries about how her account's supposed to go. But the move is to appeal to the incarnation to get around an objection like this.
Yeah. I mean, even if it didn't entail there being two persons there, I mean, it would still remain the case that the divine mind stands in no real relations whatsoever with the human mind,
Yep.
and things like that. So even if there's this one single unified person there, I don't know. It seems as though it's just like you said. It's Christ's human nature, or Christ qua human, that is sort of empathizing with us. It's not the divine nature. The divine nature stands in no real relations with us. It doesn't empathize with us. And so I guess I just don't quite see how this solves the problem. I mean, even if we can appeal to Christ, there's still that problem of the incarnation is still not a real relation on the part of God. Maybe Christ's human nature can do it, but I don't know. That's kind of my worry. But it sounds like you were sort of hinting at that, not hinting, but that's what you were saying in your second problem there.
Right, yeah, but I don't go into that into the book because
Yeah.
I guess the book had to be super short, and they already made me cut so many other things that I did not want to cut. But yeah.
But we gotta put in some bonus content in here for the viewers, our lovely viewers who definitely need to go and hit that little bell to turn on the notifications for my channel. Now I'm messing with you. You should. Okay, let's move on to chapter 5, the wrath of God and other moral judgments. And so, the Bible typically depicts God as being quite wrathful. I mean, just flip open to a random page in the Old Testament, you'll probably find that, right? And so, can you give us a sort of synopsis of this 5th chapter on the wrath of God and other moral judgments?
Mm-hmm. So this was a really frustrating chapter for me because I originally developed this really cool argument from simplicity, impassibility, and wrath. So basically, I developed this argument that the classical theistic God's his existence is dependent upon the existence of sinners. Mm-hmm. But then I had to cut out all that material. So what you get in the book is just an argument that an impassible God cannot have wrath or anger. So you end up cutting out the simplicity stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, now, of course, you're making me and the audience curious, right? So, I mean, I'm guessing it'd be something like, it is the sinners themselves, or perhaps like their sinning, that in some sense explains God's wrath, right? Mm-hmm. But under classical theism, God, and by extension God's existence, is identical with God's wrath. And so what follows is that if sinners explain God's wrath, at least in part, right? If they explain God's wrath, at least in part, and God is identical, and God's existence is identical with God's wrath, then it would follow that sinners would in some sense explain, at least in part, God's existence. But that simply can't be, right? Like, God's existence is, it's radically transcendent, it's independent, it cannot be explained, even in part, by anything outside of God. Right. So maybe I'm guessing that's the broad sort of brushstrokes of how your argument would go. But yeah, so do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, that's basically the argument. I just, was just trying to draw out some of the details there. Right. I do have a forthcoming version of a paper. I just don't know which journal I'm going to send it to yet, where I have all the details of the argument. But that's basically it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Yeah. That's super interesting. You're definitely gonna have to keep us posted with that paper. Mm-hmm. But so back to the contents of chapter 5. So I guess I should ask first, why does it matter that an impassible God can't have wrath or anger? Like, why would we want a wrathful God? So I'll turn to you for that.
Yeah, so something I point out in the book, which is important to concede from the start here, is that there are some people in the classical tradition who just say God does not have wrath, precisely because they think it is inconsistent with an impassible God's perfect happiness. But what I do is also point out there's a bunch of classical theists who really do want God to have wrath, and there's several reasons for this. But I'll just mention 2 for the video. So first, the wrath of God, like you mentioned, it's a pretty big theme in the Bible. So in the Old Testament alone, just the Old Testament, it's mentioned over 400 times. So that's quite a bit. So a classical theist, if you're trying to be consistent with the Bible, then you're going to want to affirm God's wrath. And then the second thing I'll point out for the video that's mentioned in the book is I cite different classical theists who say that God's wrath is intrinsically connected to his goodness. And so the claim from these classical thinkers is that if you cannot, like, you just can't deny that God has wrath without denying God's goodness or holiness. Because they'll say if God is not wrathful towards wickedness and sin, then you don't have any good reason to say God's good at all. And then further, some of these classical theists that I cite, they'll say that if you deny that God has wrath, then there's something morally wrong with you. Like, they say that if you're not willing to accept God's detestation of sin, then you have the wrong attitude towards God's like perfect nature. So again, you see people's normative intuitions about, like the normativity of emotions at play here. God better have these emotions, and you better have, the right sort of fear and trembling in light of God's wrath.
Yeah. So that does make sense. I like that sort of connection back to what we were talking about earlier. So it's probably important to get clear before moving on by how classical theists understand God's wrath. So can you take us through that?
So here's a quote from Arthur W. Pink on God's wrath. And Pink was a theologian, but he was also a preacher. But he was English, and my English accent sounds silly. So I won't do that. I'll just give him a slightly different voice. So he says this. He says, the wrath of God is his eternal detestation of all unrighteousness. It is the displeasure and indignation of divine equity against evil. It is the holiness of God stirred into activity against sin. So notice a couple different things about this definition of wrath. So first, Pink describes it as displeasure and indignation. And that seems to go just directly against the impassible claim that God is in this undisturbed happiness. God, at least as far as I can tell, cannot be happily indignant or blissfully displeasured. That just doesn't make any sense. Second, Pink's description says that God's wrath is stirred into activity against sin. And so God is angry because of sin. And that seems like that's going to conflict with the claim that the impassible God cannot be moved, caused, or influenced by anything external to himself.
Yeah. So is there like a sort of formalized or like syllogized version of this? I think you probably touch on that in the book. So can you, like, what's this argument for this inconsistency between impassibility and wrath?
Right. So it's so we've got four premises, three premises in the conclusion. So it goes like this. So premise 1, God has the emotion of wrath. Premise 2, if God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures, then God's wrath is dependent on creatures. Premise 3, God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures. And then you get this conclusion in premise 4, which is thus God's wrath is dependent on creatures. So again, this conclusion is that God's wrath is dependent on creatures. And that contradicts the core claim of impassibility that God cannot be moved, influenced, or caused by anything outside of himself. And so in the book, I look at some different ways for the classical theists to try to avoid this argument. So for example, you might deny that God has the emotion of wrath. And it's like I said before, there are some classical theists who do this, but if you deny God's wrath, then you have to account for all the biblical data on God's wrath. And then you also have to explain how God is morally good. And so those are some big challenges. You might be able to meet those challenges. I'm not saying you can't, but it's a big challenge. Another option, though, is just to affirm that God has wrath, but then you could just deny that God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures. So the classical theist, James Dozel, he says this, and I can't do Dozel's accent either, but he's American, so I feel like I should be able to. But here's what Dozel says. So Dozel says, our sins, be they ever so many, have no effect on God. So our sins, they just have no effect on God at all. And so I explore some different strategies here for the classical theists, but what I point out in the book is that each one seems to run up against this very weird problem. So you have to explain why God is angry, and because God's not angry at my sin, well, that seems really odd. But what else would be the object of God's wrath, if it's not my sin? I mean, maybe God's mad at himself. I don't know. That seems really weird. So, but I try to tease out the details of this on behalf of the classical theists, so that way people can, try to make up their own mind on these things.
Yeah. I mean, if I were a classical theist, I'd definitely probably want to say that God doesn't have the emotion of wrath, but then it's going to be difficult to, there's this sort of persistent theme in the Old Testament. It's not as though we're taking this one, some new atheists, internet atheists will just take this one passage and this one other passage and be like, this one says God doesn't repent. This one says God repents. But
right.
A more analogous case would be there are 400 biblical passages that say God does not repent and 400 biblical passages that say that God does repent. Right. And that seems to be the case that we have here. We have this massive Old Testament theme, and so I don't know that it just seems difficult. Again, it's not impossible, and we're not claiming these are knockdown decisive refutations. I do want to level one response on behalf of the classical theist, and so I'm wondering, do you think they could sort of extrinsicalize? Maybe I made up that word. I don't know. Do they think they could sort of extrinsicalize God's wrath? So in other words, one common strategy, right, for classical theists in avoiding like lots of other problems for their view, that William Matthews Grant that we talk about in our paper on the aloneness argument, and like they often try to adopt an extrinsic model of the feature in question. So they say that like it's constituted either in whole or in part by something external or extrinsic to God. And so perhaps they can employ this here, right? They might say that God's wrath consists in sinners receiving due punishment for their sins. And that's what it consists in. So we can truthfully say that God is wrathful, but it's not some sort of intrinsic emotional state of God. It consists instead in the sinners themselves receiving due punishment of their sins. Or perhaps in God's causing said punishment to obtain. So again, that kind of goes to Nemesh's distinction between the sort of causal and effectual sense of things. And so maybe when speaking about God's wrath, we're just saying God causes said punishment to obtain. And so prima facie, these extrinsical maneuvers seem to avoid any intrinsic negative emotional or mental state of anger, say, on the part of God. So I'm wondering what you think about this strategy for avoiding the argument.
Yeah, so one of the things I do in the book is I look at something that's similar to this strategy, but not quite. So the classical theists who deny that God has the emotion, like literally has the emotion of wrath, they'll say he metaphorically has it. And the metaphorical is that he still, doles out all this punishment on these sinners. And so in the book, and then like in a forthcoming chapter or paper where I had to, from all the material I had to cut, what I try to do is I try to argue that this still doesn't work because you still have God's wrath being explained by sinners and something external to God that's doing the explaining. So even if he doesn't have the emotion, he's still doing actions for a reason, and the reason seems to be because of the sinners. Now, but I think what's going on here with these metaphorical approaches, though, is that they're taking God's wrathful actions to be intrinsic to God. And the suggestion you're laying out here, though, is that God's maybe all of God's wrathful actions are external to God in the way that someone like Grant does. I guess if that's the case, I just kind of lose my grasp on why I should think that these things are completely external to God. If I want to say there's all this stuff that's completely external to God, why should I really say that counts as God's actions? So, I look at Joe suffering certain things and be like, well, it seems like it's a divine judgment. Was it God's divine judgment? I don't know, because it's not like God's anything intrinsic to God, something completely extrinsic to God. So I really lose my grasp on how we're even talking about God's actions anymore. But that's just a general worry I have about this entire account of external or extrinsic action, divine action.
Yeah, and that, of course, opens up a big can of worms with respect to extrinsic models of divine action, divine knowledge, and so on. And we talk about some of that in some of our previous videos. Yeah, so we can refer viewers to those as well. Yeah. But I did want to just briefly at least flag that so that viewers can get a sense that we're trying to help out the classical theists in responding to these things. Like they could extrinsicalize, they could take metaphorical approach, and so on. And of course, we're trying to tease out certain implications of taking those views as well. And so I guess we can turn now to a sort of the neoclassical view, right? So we've been talking about the classical theist conception or how it relates to God's wrath, but how does the neoclassical theist who affirms passibility, how do they do with respect to God's wrath?
Right. So you might think it's a easy slam dunk. They can be like, God has a range of emotions. There we go. He's got wrath. But what I do is I consider two different underdeveloped complaints against the consistency of passibility in God's wrath. And so I try to develop these arguments on behalf of the classical theist. But for the sake of time for this video, I'll just mention just the big idea of the objection. So the main objection is that if God is passible, then you might say he cannot be trustworthy in his moral judgments. So maybe you can do it something like this. So you could say a passible God, he's going to change his knowledge and emotional states over time. And a God like that just cannot be trusted to make good moral judgments or good promises, either because God's emotions and his judgments are just based on emotional fleeting whims, or he just doesn't have enough knowledge at the moment to make a good judgment. So maybe God decides to, it's a good idea to punish you in a particular way. But then a few years later, God realizes oh gosh, I've learned some things now. That was a really terrible idea. Well, if that's the case, then you just can't trust a God like that at all. It's not trustworthy.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely want to, it sounds like they're just implicitly substituting in open theme. Okay, but I'll let you respond to it. So how does a passibilist like you respond to that objection?
Right. So yeah. So I had a whole nice things on how open theists would respond to it, but then it got cut from the book. So what I do is, again, since the neoclassical theists, they say God's got exhaustive foreknowledge, so it seems like they're not going to have this problem. There's a couple different ways you could be a neoclassical theist, though, because there's like several different ways you could affirm exhaustive foreknowledge. So you could be a Calvinist or a theological determinist of some sort. You could be a Mullinist. You might affirm simple foreknowledge. You got options. Either way, you've got a view of God where God has more than enough knowledge of the future to ensure that his moral judgments and his punishments, they're going to turn out to be good. They're not going to turn out to be these like really terrible miscarriages of justice a few years later. God's not going to go, ooh, wait, that was a terrible idea. I wish I hadn't done that. He's got enough foreknowledge to prevent that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, that would also seem to count against perfect rationality, which is precisely something that neoclassical theists affirm of God. Like, he's a radically metaphysically perfect being. He's not going to be bundling or bungling or whatever the word is. He's not going to be effing up this sort of stuff. I definitely want to keep this PG. So
Sure.
yeah, maybe I can like bleep that out later. No, we'll see. So let's move on to the Chapter 6. Well, actually, this is the one that we can actually probably point to other videos. But this was on divine empathy and the problem of creepy emotions. And so, yeah, maybe do you have anything to say on that, or?
I guess I'll just say this. So, like you said, this is a video, or we've done several videos just on this theme. But what I try to do in the book is to make sure I've got a nice even balance of arguments for and against each view. Mm-hmm. And so I've got, the love argument against impassibility, and I've got a wrath argument against impassibility. Well, then I also have like a wrath argument against passibility, and then I close it with this creepy emotions argument against passibility. So you've got two sorts of arguments against each view. The big idea with the creepy emotions one is to go, well, let's look at a bunch of different emotions that if God empathizes with, seems like it'd be really gross, maybe immoral, maybe even irrational for God to have these things. And then I try to develop some different responses. But like I said, we've done some different videos on that already. But that way, you've got this nice view, a nice well-rounded discussion of two different arguments against each view.
Yeah, okay. So that I think we're gonna go into our bonus that we wanted to touch on. Mm-hmm. But that sort of concludes sort of what we were going to talk about with respect to the contents of the book, and going back and forth, maybe probing things that he said in the book, like the extrinsic models, things like that. And so I definitely think I advise all viewers to definitely check out the book. You can look in the description. It might, is it out yet? I mean, I think it might. They said August, but
they said August. They haven't given me an exact date yet. So am I just any day now?
But
I don't know.
But there's like a link on Cambridge Elements to it. It's just like it's like a kind of blank, and I don't think it says. It might not say buy yet, but there definitely will be a link in the description that you can click on to check it out for the viewers. But yeah, that sort of summarizes what we're going to talk about with respect to the book God and Emotion. But I do want to talk about because we have some time left. I do want to talk about the problem of arbitrary creation for impassibility. So I believe this was probably something that you'd cut out from your manuscript or from your book, and it was recently published. I think what was it? The journal Open Theology by De Gruyter. I think it was. I think that's how you pronounce it. Like De Gruyter. Like I don't even know.
Yeah, I can't pronounce it. I don't have the accent for it. Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah. Can you basically give us the general outline of that kind of argument there, and how? There seems to be a tension between God's transitive actions being for a reason and divine impassibility.
Yeah, so I had come across this quote from Bertrand Brasnet, who is this Scottish thinker from the early 20th century who was arguing against impassibility. And he says, like, there's just no reason why a perfectly happy God would create a universe. And he doesn't really spell out the argument, but I just kind of thought, I think there's something there. I feel like there is. And so what I try to do in this open theology paper is just to go, okay, let's see here. What is perfect rationality? Perfect rationality means God always acts for a reason. And if it's also going to be a good reason, it's going to be like a sufficient reason of some sort. And then look at what would be God's reasons for creating a universe. What are the standard kind of answers that theists give to what's called the general problem of creation? Why would God create anything at all? Mm-hmm. Well, all of those sorts of answers that are typically given are things like, well, creates the best possible world. Well, what's the best possible world? A world where there's like all these great values. Well, these are values that are extrinsic to God, and so that's a consideration that's external to God. Well, but an impassible God can't be influenced by anything external. And Arthur W. Pink and others, like, they make this really clear that God cannot be influenced by anything that's external, not even like foreseen good actions that you might perform. That couldn't be, anything that would influence why God selects a particular timeline to create, or why God would love you. They're like, no external influence whatsoever. So best possible world, that's out. Can't have that. And then I look at, well, maybe what are some other possible answers to give? And each one, like you just go through the list, they are all based on some kind of extrinsic consideration. And so what we need is some sort of explanation for why God performs what we call this transitive action instead of what's called an imminent action. I guess we should probably say something about that distinction. So an imminent action, classical theists say that imminent actions are actions that are performed ad intra, so within the divine life. So the Father's generating of the Son and spirating of the Spirit. These are actions that have God as the end of the action. So the aim for these particular ad intra actions, these imminent actions, are God himself.
And they're necessary, too.
They're necessary, yeah. So God necessarily has himself as the end of, or aim of these actions, and he necessarily performs them. The transitive actions, though, these are contingent actions, and they are actions that have something external to God as the end or aim. So if you want to appeal to why would God create anything at all, and it would be like, well, God always has himself as the end goal. And you're like, well, no, you're talking about an imminent action. A transitive action is one where creation, creatures, something outside of God is the aim or the goal. So it can't be God himself that you appeal to for why he creates this. And then I'm not the first person to point this out. So classical theists like Paul Helm make a big deal out of this. There's a Calvinist French thinker named Moses Amarat who also points this out. He says things like God's glory, God's goodness, God's majesty. That can't be God's reasons for creating because God necessarily has those things, and those are things God necessarily does. So we need an answer for why God performs these extrinsic transitive actions, these contingent actions.
Yeah, and so I was almost, when I was reading it, I was almost getting a sense that it's almost like a razor's edge problem. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's almost as though like we have to find some sort of adequate reason for God's creating the universe. And on the one hand, like there are two extremes that the classical theist has to avoid, and I say extremes. One of them is to avoid there being some sort of consideration extrinsic to God that somehow influences God to act. So that would be something extrinsic to the divine nature, the consideration of which, sort of moves or influences God in some manner to act as he does. And so that's one edge of the razor that they can't sort of fall on. But then on the other edge, it's like, well, you can't go too much extrinsic, but you also can't go too much intrinsic, because when we're only specifying the sort of intrinsic operations of God, it seems as though those have no reference to creation whatsoever. Like these things are utterly invariant across all worlds. I mean, they're necessarily obtaining in worlds where God coexists with an infinite multiverse, or in worlds where God exists alone. Like it would be that same sort of reason. So it seems as though it doesn't have any specifications whatsoever to creation, doesn't make any reference to creation. So it's unclear how it constitutes a reason for creating. And so it's this sort of razor edge. It's like, how do you find this balance between like an extrinsic motivational factor versus intrinsic motivational factors that don't have any intrinsic specification or reference to creation. So there does seem to be that sort of teeter-totter balance there that's very difficult to find like a satisfactory solution. I know you go through like 6 different ones, 6 different proposals. So I'll also link that in the description. But yeah, do you have anything further to add on what I was saying there?
Yeah, I guess one other thought is that I discussed in that paper is what I call the no unsatisfied desires criteria. So classical theists say God doesn't have any unfulfilled desires because God's perfectly self-satisfied. And that makes it really tricky when you're talking in terms of why would God create anything at all? Because typically you're going to say, well, it seems like whatever he's referring to, whatever the reason would be, it's going to be some kind of thing that God doesn't have. And well, oh gosh, you can't have God having unfulfilled or unsatisfied desires if you got the God of classical theism. So that makes it even more challenging to try to pinpoint what is the reason for God creating. And it seems like then the way I try to push the argument is that it's going to be completely arbitrary action. And some theists do say that. Like there's some different thinkers in the Jewish tradition and in the Islamic tradition who say, yeah, all of God's actions, they're just arbitrary. But you've also got thinkers in those same traditions going, that's nuts. We can't have that. And here are some of the consequences why I think you do not want an arbitrary creation. So if you're looking at arguments for the existence of God, and you're looking at debates between just theists and atheists in general, typically what the theist says, they'll say, I have an edge over atheism because I've got a reason for why the universe exists. The reason exists for a particular reason. And the atheist might have to say, "Ooh, no, there's no reason why the universe exists." And so the theist is like, "Haha, point in my favor." Well, if you get rid of this, if like creation just becomes completely arbitrary, then it exists for literally no reason. And in which case, then theists have no edge whatsoever over the atheist. So, in terms of like natural theology and arguments for the existence of God, if this is a problem for classical theism, that's a pretty devastating problem, because it then now entails you. I don't know what sort of arguments for the existence of God you're going to do. Maybe you can do some other ones, maybe like a ontological argument or something, which I think those are kind of fun. But like contingency arguments, cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, those seem like they all go out the window. So the consequences are pretty big here if the argument works.
Yeah, and so I also want to touch on like different maybe extensions of this, because I know I was talking to you in voice messages on Facebook, and I was just like, oh, there are some really interesting extensions and like different justifications that you could also bring to bear. And so I'm actually working on different papers, like sort of extending this to other problems in philosophy. Well, one of them, or two other justifications we might think, apart from you going through these sort of these 6 different ones, and showing that they either fall on one of those two edges, and either they're too extrinsic or too intrinsic, or, that's my phraseology. Sure. So in addition to that, in addition to your reasoning for that, to justify the claim that God's transitive actions seem as though they're performed without any reason, not on the basis of a reason, I was basically thinking of 2 additional arguments for that thesis. So one of them is that reasons, whatever they're supposed to be, they count in favor of actions. They're sort of considerations that count in favor of an action and thereby explain it in some sense, at least in part. Right. So they explain actions, at least in part. There might be other kinds of explanations, like other factors that explain action, like the agent's intentions or the agent him or herself or what have you. But all we need is that reasons, by their very nature, because they count in favor of actions, in some sense explain the action. But, right, God is identical to God's actions, or God's action, right? In which case, if a reason were to be explanatory or were to explain God's action, it would follow that something would explain God, and hence God's existence, because God is identical to God's existence. But God's existence cannot be explained by anything, right? There isn't some sort of reason extrinsic to God that explains it. Now, you might say that, God's existence explains God's existence. I mean, well, first of all, we're not talking about God's existence explaining God's existence. We're talking about his reason for creating explaining God's existence. So that's not relevant. But the second thing is, in my estimation, self-explanation, something can explain or account for how it itself is in reality at all, seems to me to just be incoherent. Like, in order to exist, something, it seems as though it would, or in order to have any explanatory power, it would seem as though it would already, as it were, have to exist in order to have that explanatory power. And so explanation just seems irreflexive to my mind.
Okay.
So those are 2 problems with that. And so what we get as a result of that is that if classical theism is true, well, then God's existence couldn't be explained, at least by a reason. And if that's the case, well, then it follows that God's action is not performed on the basis of a reason, because, as we saw, the very nature of reasons is such that they explain action. So, that I think that's another way to bolster your argument. That's one of them. And then before I'll turn it over to you, there's a second one, which is just that whatever else God's reason for creating is supposed to do, it seems to be explanatorily prior to the obtaining of creation, right? It's supposed to it's supposed to be the very thing that counts in favor of creating in the first place, and hence it seems to be something that is explanatorily prior, and hence metaphysically or ontologically prior, because explanans are prior to their explananda. And so once we get that if it's prior to creation, because it's supposed to be accounting for God's action and creation in the first place, well, then it's not created, right? It's an uncreated thing. But God's the only uncreated thing, and hence this reason would be utterly identical to God himself. And if that's the case, well, then, like, it seems as though God doesn't, after all, have a reason for creating, because a reason for creating is supposed to be something that is in some sense like directed at or directed towards the referent, like creation, right? Like reasons count in favor of something and are thereby directed towards it, but God himself is not directed towards anything ad extra, right? And so if God is identical to this reason, or if we suppose that creation is on the basis of a reason. Sorry, everyone, I'm talking off the top of my head, so I'm not going off of any script or anything. But if we say that God's action is performed on the basis of a reason, and I just showed how that entails that God is identical to that reason, but the reason is sort of directed towards something ad extra to the divine nature, but God is not, we get a sort of contradiction. How could God be identical to that reason if the reason is directed at something ad extra to the divine nature, but God himself is not. And so in order to avoid that contradiction, we have to deny the starting assumption, namely that God creates on the basis of a reason.
Right.
And another way to see this would be maybe someone would deny that, hey, because I had that premise that reasons, or the only uncreated thing is God, right? Because I argued that reasons are prior to creation and hence aren't part of creation, and hence they're uncreated, and hence if the only thing that's uncreated is God, well then reasons would be identical with God. They might say, no, there are uncreated things, they're just intrinsic to God, right? And so these reasons would sort of be maybe intrinsic mental states of God or intrinsic considerations of God, maybe abstracta. But then we're just denying divine simplicity, because anything intrinsic to God is supposed to be identical to God. If there was something distinct from God that's intrinsic to him, then there would be something distinct from God. That is to say, there would be something that is not God, without which God would not exist. And that's precisely what classical theists say when it comes to aseity, that's what they say as an objection to neoclassical theism. They're like, hey, you guys have something intrinsic to God, or something that's not strictly speaking identical to God, without which God would not exist. And so you guys are denying aseity. And so by this proposal, that reasons, or that God isn't the only uncreated thing, they might be denying divine simplicity, it seems. And this is a long-winded way to say that these are two different reasons. The first one was that reasons explain action, but God's existence can't be explained. And then the second one is just that reasons are supposed to be ontologically prior to creation, and so they're uncreated. And so they'd have to be identical to God, but God isn't directed at something ad extra. I know I'm going on for a long time, but it's definitely very interesting ways to kind of tease out how we might think that under classical theism, God cannot create for a reason. And so I'm wondering what you think about those two extensions, or I guess not extensions, but justifications of your problem of arbitrary creation.
Yeah, so I need to think a bit more about the issue of self-explanation in terms of like God's existence. So I don't really know exactly what to say about that. But I do think there's something in the neighborhood here, though, that I do know that certain classical theists are deeply worried by, though. So Catherine Rogers is deeply worried about this issue of, if God has to create, then it looks like his aseity is going to be called into question. And so she actually tries to address this in a couple different writings. I'm not fully satisfied with the answer, and I know that I don't think she's fully satisfied with it either. So trying to twist the knife in this sort of way, I think is good, because then you've got someone who is a classical theist going, yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem. We got to think through it. The other issue, though, is, so it seems like you're right. Yeah, if classical theists want to say that God cannot be moved or influenced or anything by anything outside himself, so he's always going to be directed towards himself. And then we also want to say God has a reason. If the reason is going to be something that's not directed towards himself, you're going to have this contradiction. And if they're going to be identical, it can't be identical to God. So if they really do want to just keep appealing to these reasons, you can't make it identical to God. Otherwise, you're going to have this contradiction in the very nature of God. Ooh, that's a problem. You don't want that. Yeah. And if they do try to make it identical to God and say maybe they can find a way to where it's not contradictory, I think you're going to have a necessary creation, which is fine to some extent, not for classical theists, because the classical theist wants creation to be contingent. But if you're like a panentheist, you could just be like, yeah, it's fine, cool, I'll accept a necessary creation. So it's bad news for classical theists, but it's good news for a panentheist, who, in panentheists, some affirm simplicity, some don't, but they in general seem to affirm a necessary creation. So they would be like, yeah, cool, thanks for giving more justification for our view. So much the worse for classical theism, yay panentheism. So I think there's a couple different ways you could try to develop some of these arguments and try to push in different directions. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see all the details there laid out.
Yeah, and I can send you the papers when I'm done sort of working on that. Hopefully within the next 2 weeks, I'll be able to send them to you. But before we close off this interview, I do want to say, or I did want to mention that there are also, so those are two sort of buttressing reasons that I was giving in favor of your one of your premises that God's transitive actions or transitive act is not on the basis of a reason. So those were two additional supports for that. Now there are also different extensions of the argument, and this is something that I was talking to you in the voice messages. So we could extend it to induction, and we can extend it to persistence. And I'm going to be talking about those in the papers that I was talking about as well. And so really we have this bridge premise which says that if God can't create for a reason, well then He also can't sort of sustain things in existence for a reason, because again, all the same arguments would apply to sustenance as to creation, and of course they're one and the same transitive act. And so we would get that there's no reason whatsoever, because God's supposed to be the explanation. The world's persisting from moment to moment to moment. What we get is that there would be no reason one way as opposed to the other. It's genuinely possible, given God's radical freedom, that he sustain the world for any particular moment or refrain from sustaining it at that moment. Mm-hmm. But per this bridge premise that if God doesn't create for a reason, then he doesn't sustain for a reason, then there would be no reason, like in the explanans, in the explanation for the reality's persistence, for it going one way or the other. Persistent existence or not persistent existence for any given moment. And so what we get is we get this, it would seem as though the principle of indifference demands that we assign like a 0.5 probability then for each moment after moment after moment after moment after moment, to realities either persisting or not persisting at that individual moment. And so what we do is we sort of, we get this moment, and it's almost like a coin toss. And if you get thousands of such moments, that'd be like flipping a heads thousands of times. It's monstrously improbable under classical theism that we would get this persistent existence, given that there's no reason in the sort of, in the explanans for persistence, given that there's no reason, it would seem monstrously improbable that we get this persistent existence, one direction, consistently favoring one direction, when the explanans has no reason or sort of inclination one way as opposed to the other. And so when you multiply all those together, you get a base factor compared to basically any other hypothesis on which God does create for a reason, or on a sort of necessary persistence hypothesis, like naturalists might say that matter is necessarily conserved. They would get a base factor that monstrously disfavors classical theism, and that monstrously favors either neoclassical theism or naturalism, or the sort of necessary persistence hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So that's one line of argument, the persistence line of argument. Another one is inductive inference. So persistence is kind of looking past forward, like there are all these different moments, but inductive inference is looking like now to the future, right? So if God doesn't act for a reason, well, then he also doesn't sustain future moments for reasons, and hence he doesn't have any sort of particular reason to prefer uniformity with the past or conformity with the past, as opposed to a sort of chaotic future, or like a future in which all the inductive inferences that we make now from here to the past are violated in the future. And so it seems as though we get a sort of undercutting defeater for inductive inference itself, because, again, the explanation for the future's uniformity, which under classical theism and universal divine causality, that would be God, we don't have any particular reason. Actually, we have positive reason to think that the explanation itself has no reason one way or the other toward the sort of uniform inductive world opposed to the sort of non-inductive worlds. Because again, in God's radical providence, he could choose one way or the other. So anyway, I know I'm sort of going out and like spelling out the arguments that I'm leveling in my papers, but what do you think about those two extensions?
So if the argument of my arbitrary creation paper works, then I think these two extensions are also going to follow. And I think you can add a whole bunch of others too. So most of the things that like Christian theists are going to want to say, they're going to want to have things like not just like that God creates and sustains, but they're also going to have like God providentially arranging the world. Mm-hmm. And that could be like, lots of different theories of providence. You could have a determinist story, you have a Mullins story, what have you. Well, then God has no reasons for any of those things. I don't know what providence even looks like or what it could even mean on that sort of story. Christians definitely want there to be a really good reason for why God became incarnate. Oof. Gosh, I don't know. I don't know what that's going to be, because it can't be anything, based on external considerations. It can't be anything based on an unsatisfied desire. It can't be anything based on ad intra to God, because those are all necessary actions. So we're talking about, contingent actions. Yeah, you can extend it lots of different ways. So if the arbitrary creation argument works, then you can extend it, and I think in a ton of different ways to basically make
explosion.
The entire Christian story utterly meaningless is I guess the worry. Yeah, and that's devastating. That's pretty bad. And then you can add on top of things like induction as well. That seems yeah. So if it works, there's a huge knock-on effect. But the big issue is it doesn't work. Yeah.
Definitely that central premise is like under classical theism, God cannot transitively act for a reason. Like that's the
Right.
central premise. But as we've seen, like you go through a bunch of different proposals and you argue, you level arguments for that in your paper. And I also have these sort of two extensions that I was articulating rather poorly earlier. But don't worry, the paper won't articulate it poorly. Again, I was just going off like the top of my head, because this was a sort of just bonus talk at the end that we didn't really plan out or anything.
No.
So sorry for springing that on you, but I thought
That's
it was pretty exciting just to give people a sort of understanding of what's on the edge of research in philosophy, religion, models of God, things like that. But so definitely, do you have any closing remarks before we say goodbye on the book or on our conversation or anything?
I guess just I hope that people are able to get into the book and really think through the issues very carefully, because what I do is I try very hard to lay out, here's the models, here are the arguments for and against each view, and then just let people figure out what they want to think about the issue or how they want to feel about the issue. What I start the book is there's this guy named Marshall Randalls in the year 1900 who is very deeply worried about this coming tide of passibility, and he wants to defend impassibility. And he says, this is just a passing mood. Passibility is just gonna be a little blip on the radar. That's it. And then the entire 20th century goes the opposite direction. So he just made this horribly false prediction. What I do in the book is I make this prediction that impassibility is actually going to make a big comeback, that the current resurgence of it is not going to be really a passing mood. I think it's going to be a big comeback. I might be completely massively wrong in the way that Marshall Randalls was in the year 1900. But what all that really depends on is how people react to the book. So what I hope is people read the book, then they react to it, and then we can kind of figure out where's the future of theology and philosophy of religion going to go from here.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely people check out the book, check out the links in the description. I've linked a lot of different stuff, so lots of good material in there. Thank you, Dr. Ryan Mullins, for coming on. It was a wonderful conversation. Just for all watching, I guess we didn't really talk about whether or not God is an angsty teen, but maybe he is. I mean, we gave arguments for passibility, so I guess God is an angsty teen. But anyway, I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason. Peace out.